The quiet glance that changed everything. The rain had just stopped in Los Angeles, leaving behind a golden shimmer on the pavement as the sun peeked through scattered clouds. On the studio backlot, where time often stood still, a gentle breeze rustled the rows of planted trees standing like silent witnesses to decades of Hollywood history. It was on this lot, years ago, that a young Sandra Bullock had first walked into a trailer she wasn't supposed to be in, only to find Keanu Reeves sitting on the floor with headphones on, eyes closed, completely lost in the moment of a film soundtrack. That memory, though buried beneath layers of work and years, still lived quietly in the corners of her mind, like an unopened letter she couldn't bring herself to read. Today, however, was different. There was something in the air, an unspoken electricity. Sandra had returned to this lot not for a role, but for a tribute interview to commemorate their iconic 1994 film, Speed, now celebrating its 30th anniversary. Keanu would be there too. She hadn't seen him in nearly 3 years, not since the last awards season, when they exchanged a polite hug, a smile too measured and words that felt rehearsed. But beneath all of that still existed a river of what-ifs. She could feel them rising now, threatening to break through the dam of her resolve. Inside the soundstage, a crew was setting up for the tribute. Lighting rigs hung like mechanical chandeliers above the makeshift interview set. Chairs were placed at calculated angles, water bottles set with brand labels turned discreetly. Sandra arrived early, as always. She wore a soft, charcoal gray blouse tucked into high-waisted cream slacks. Elegant, understated, timeless. Her hair fell in loose waves, framing a face that carried wisdom, grace, and a trace of that mischievous youth the world had once fallen in love with. She took her seat and breathed in the stillness, trying not to overthink what she might say when Keanu walked in. But she didn't have to wait long. The door opened gently. No grand entrance, no entourage, just him. Keanu Reeves, in his quietly iconic way, stepped into the space as if it were a meditation hall. Dressed in a black suit without a tie, shirt collar open, hair slightly tousled, he looked as if he had walked out of a dream she had too often suppressed. He saw her before she saw him, because he had paused just for a heartbeat to absorb the moment. When she finally turned, her eyes widened, softly, genuinely, and her lips parted with a half-smile, the kind that said, "I wasn't ready, but I'm glad you're here. Hey, stranger," she said, standing. "Hey, beautiful," he replied, without missing a beat, and just like that, the years melted. The hug they shared was long, not performative, not camera-friendly. It was the kind of hug two people share when time has both separated and preserved them. His hand stayed at her back for just a second longer than necessary. Her cheek lingered against his shoulder before pulling away, their eyes meeting with a gaze too fragile to hold, too sacred to ignore. As the camera started rolling and questions about speed and chemistry and working together back then came up, they both answered like professionals. They laughed. They reminisced. They even reenacted a few funny lines for the crew, who chuckled from behind the monitors. But something lived in the spaces between their words. In the quiet moments when their eyes would meet off-camera, in the seconds their hands would brush when reaching for water, and in the deep sighs they both exhaled after each take. When the interview wrapped, and the crew began packing up, neither of them moved. They sat there, the artificial lights dimming slowly, their shadows elongated on the wall behind them like versions of their younger selves still whispering promises they never dared to speak aloud. "You hungry?" Keanu asked quietly. Sandra hesitated for a beat, then nodded. "Always." They walked out into the cool Los Angeles dusk, just as the first stars peeked through the sky. He didn't call for a driver. She didn't check her phone. Instead, they walked. 2 blocks away, a quiet little restaurant glowed under string lights. The hostess recognized them instantly but said nothing, just offered a smile and led them to a corner booth, giving them the kind of privacy usually reserved for miracles. Over pasta and wine, the years unfolded. Not with regret, but with curiosity. "Do you remember that night we stayed late after filming and just drove?" she asked, twirling a strand of pasta on her fork. I remember I didn't want to drop you off, he replied. Sandra looked down at her plate, a small smile tugging at the edge of her lips. Why didn't you say something back then? Keanu leaned forward, eyes soft. Because I didn't want to be just another Hollywood cliché. And because I thought you already knew. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was honest. It was the sound of two hearts trying to remember how to beat in the same rhythm after so many years apart. I did know, Sandra whispered, but I didn't know what to do with it. They sat for a long while, neither rushing to fill the quiet. For two people who had spent their lives being asked about others, characters, co-stars, scripts, this moment was only theirs. He reached across the table, took her hand gently. Sandra, he began, voice low and vulnerable, do you think it's too late? Her fingers tightened around his. I think some things wait for the right time. Maybe this is ours. Outside, the night stretched like a blessing over them. The world didn't know yet. The tabloids didn't know. The fans didn't know. But something sacred had shifted between them. And this time, they weren't going to let it slip away. The night they didn't want to end. The restaurant was quiet now, the clinking of cutlery replaced by a soft hum of jazz from the overhead speakers. Outside, the city moved on in its usual rhythm, cars sliding through wet streets, people rushing past neon lights, but inside that small corner booth, time had slowed for Sandra and Keanu. Their untouched dessert sat between them, forgotten as they leaned closer, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something rediscovered. It wasn't the first time they had been alone, but it was the first time they had spoken as who they truly were, without cameras, without expectations, without scripts. They weren't co-stars. They weren't Hollywood's fantasy. They were just Keanu and Sandra, two people who had walked parallel roads for 3 decades, never crossing the invisible line that had always buzzed quietly between them. You know, Sandra said, stirring the coffee she never intended to drink. There were nights I used to imagine what it would be like if we'd had the courage to mess everything up. Keanu tilted his head, amused. Mess everything up? You know what I mean, she said with a soft laugh. The press, the public, friends telling us it wasn't the right time, our agents warning us not to ruin the magic by making it real. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for the tiny spoon she had been nervously turning and took it from her fingers, gently placing it on the table. His eyes didn't leave hers. And yet, he said, voice low and steady, the magic never went away. Sandra felt her breath catch. It wasn't just his words. It was the way he looked at her, like she was the only real thing in a world full of shadows. She leaned back, trying to collect herself, but her voice betrayed her vulnerability. I thought about you every time I chose someone else. I kept thinking maybe we were just a beautiful idea, something too perfect to ruin by making it real. Keanu nodded slowly, as if those words mirrored his own unspoken thoughts. I used to tell myself that too, that if we got too close we'd lose the very thing that made us, us. Their waiter appeared, breaking the trance, asking if they'd like anything else. Both shook their heads with polite smiles, but the magic didn't dissipate. It simply waited. As they walked out into the night once more, the wind carried the scent of blooming jacaranda trees, and street lamps lit their path like golden breadcrumbs. Keanu's hand brushed hers, and this time he didn't pull away. There was no paparazzi, no entourage, just two people beneath an open sky, finally walking side by side. They found a small park just a few blocks away, empty, still damp from the earlier rain. The benches glistened, and the grass shimmered in the moonlight. Keanu motioned toward the swings with a mischievous grin. Last one, there's buying breakfast, he said. Sandra's laugh was loud and real as she kicked off her heels and jogged barefoot onto the playground, her blouse fluttering behind her like she was 20 years younger. He followed, slower, laughing too, watching her reclaim a piece of herself she'd almost forgotten. They swung in silence for a while, the creaking chains the only sound between them. I missed this version of me, she said softly, not looking at him. What version? He asked. The one that's not acting? The one that's allowed to just feel without performing. Keanu stopped swinging and turned to face her, feet dragging against the dirt. "That version of you is the one I've always loved." She froze. The words hung in the air, weightless and infinite. "Keanu." "I mean it," he said gently, standing now. "Not the movie star. Not the interview charm. Just you. The way you wrinkle your nose when you're thinking. The way you always look like you're about to say something brilliant. Or something that'll make me laugh. The way you never let the world turn you cold, even when it tried." Sandra stood too, barefoot in the grass, her eyes wide and unreadable. "I spent years wondering what it meant," she whispered. "Was it just nostalgia? Chemistry? The way fans talked about us like we were some untouchable fantasy?" He took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool air. "It was always real. I just didn't think I deserved it," she blinked, tears threatening behind her lashes. "And what if we're too late?" Keanu shook his head. "Too late for what? To start something honest? To stop pretending we don't look for each other in every room we walk into? I don't care how old we are, Sandy. I care that you're standing here now." She didn't reply, not with words. She stepped forward, gently laid her forehead against his chest and closed her eyes. His arms came around her like muscle memory, and the world fell away. They stood like that for minutes, maybe more, until the chill made her shiver and he took off his jacket, wrapping it around her without asking. As they sat down again, this time on a bench slick with dew, Sandra looked at him with a different kind of question in her eyes. "Why didn't we ever talk like this before?" Keanu's smile was slow, tender. "Because we were always saving our best scenes for everyone else," she laughed. A real laugh, deep from the belly. And then she reached for his hand. "No more saving," she said. "No more hiding," he replied. The sun had not yet risen, but the night had already begun to break. A new light stretched across the sky, pale and hopeful, like the first page of a long-forgotten book being opened again. And for the first time in a very long time, they weren't characters in someone else's story. They were writing their own. They thought it was just dinner, but it became something deeper. The next morning arrived not with loud declarations, but in the quiet rustle of early sunbeams pressing through linen curtains. Sandra sat at her kitchen table with a warm mug of tea, her bare feet tucked under her in a posture of comfort that hadn't visited her in years. Her phone sat silent beside her, though her thoughts were anything but. The night with Keanu had carved a space inside her, wide, unfiltered, unafraid. And now that the mask had been removed, even for a moment, she wasn't sure how to wear it again. Across town, Keanu stood by the window of his house, coffee in hand, wearing the same black jacket he'd draped over Sandra's shoulders just hours ago. It still held the faintest trace of her perfume, a soft, floral memory that stirred something deep in his chest. He wasn't thinking about how it would look. He wasn't worrying about press speculation or career complications. He was thinking about the swing set, the way she'd laughed barefoot under the stars, and the words they had said, finally, after all these years. Neither one texted immediately. There was no need for posturing or dramatics. It wasn't silence born of doubt. It was a silence wrapped in understanding, like a sacred space neither wanted to rush. Later that afternoon, Sandra's doorbell rang, not with urgency but with familiarity. When she opened the door, there he was, holding 2 paper bags from her favorite Thai place. No fanfare, no speech, just the kind of gesture only someone who truly knew her would make. "I figured you'd be too lost in your head to eat," Keanu said with a half-smile. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed playfully. "And you figured right." They didn't speak much as they unpacked the food. Keanu moved around her kitchen with practiced ease, like he'd done it 100 times. Maybe in another timeline he had. And as they sat cross-legged on the floor, plates resting on the coffee table, the conversation flowed with the kind of intimacy that didn't need to prove itself. "So," Sandra began, spearing a piece of chicken, "are we going to pretend last night didn't happen? Or are we going to talk about it like grown-ups?" Keanu leaned back against the sofa, eyes studying her with that patient calm that had always been his hallmark. "I don't want to pretend. Not anymore." "Good," she said, setting her plate down. "Because I've been doing that for way too long." He nodded slowly. "Me too." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and there it was again. That pull. That gravitational thread that had tethered them for decades. Invisible to the world, but undeniable to them. "I used to think I missed a chance," Sandra said, her voice dropping. "That if we had done something back then, maybe things would have been different. But now I wonder if we were just waiting for the right version of ourselves to show up." Keanu exhaled through his nose, thoughtful. "Maybe we had to live all the other versions first. Maybe this one, right now, is the only one that could last." There was a pause as the weight of his words settled. Not heavy, not frightening, but real. And real was something both of them had learned to cherish in a world full of illusion. Later that evening, Sandra offered to drive him home, even though he had come in his own car. They both knew it was an excuse to stretch the day just a little longer, to prolong the comfort of being in each other's presence without the demands of the outside world. They drove with the windows down, the cool evening wind tugging at their hair. The city sparkled around them, but neither looked away from the road or each other. It wasn't a romantic comedy. There was no soundtrack playing in the background. But something far more beautiful was unfolding. Honesty. "I remember watching you once at an awards show," she said as they pulled up to a red light, "and you were standing off to the side, away from everyone. Like you were observing a world you didn't belong to." Keanu turned to her, his profile caught in the golden hue of passing headlights. "I've always felt like an outsider in that world. Except when I was next to you." Those words sat between them like an open door. Sandra parked in front of his home and turned off the engine, but neither of them moved. There was a stillness to the air, not of hesitation, but of knowing, like two people standing at the threshold of something sacred. Not quite ready to cross, but not willing to turn back either. Keanu reached over, his fingers brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek, his hand lingering near her jawline. His thumb moved slowly, gently, and she leaned into it, not because she had to, but because every part of her wanted to. "I don't want to lose what we have," she said softly. "But I also don't want to go another year wondering what might have been." He didn't kiss her, not yet. But the closeness between them held more power than any kiss could have in that moment. "I'm not asking for a promise," he said, voice low and certain. "Just a beginning." And with those simple words, Sandra Bullock smiled, not the red carpet smile, not the one polished for interviews, but a soft, vulnerable, deeply human smile that belonged to no one else but him. "A beginning," she repeated. He stepped out of the car, and before closing the door, he looked back at her. "Tomorrow night, dinner, just us." She nodded, already knowing she'd spend the next 24 hours feeling like the version of herself she thought she'd lost. As she drove away, her heart wasn't racing. It was steady, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was simply allowing herself to hope. And hope, in the hands of two people like Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, was not a fragile thing. It was a promise that life, real life, wasn't done surprising them yet. A table set for two, and years of silence unraveled. The evening began not with extravagance but with intention. Keanu had insisted on cooking, and Sandra had agreed with a laugh that danced between teasing and curiosity. It was the kind of date no one would believe they hadn't already had in 30 years of friendship. But the truth was, this wasn't just dinner. This was a line being crossed. Quietly. A line neither of them had dared approach in the years. They'd floated around each other like two stars in close orbit. Keanu's home was tucked behind. A wall of overgrown hedges and time-worn gates. The kind of house that didn't flaunt its presence but offered safety to the one who lived inside. It was quiet, warm, filled with books and art that spoke of a life lived not for headlines, but for depth. As Sandra stepped through the doorway, the smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air, and it hit her. How many nights had she imagined walking into his home like this? Not as a visitor, not for press or industry events, but simply as herself. He looked up from the kitchen as she entered, apron tied around his waist, sleeves rolled just below the elbow. The sight of him, utterly domestic and yet entirely magnetic, made her chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to longing. "You cooked?" she asked with playful skepticism slipping off her jacket. "I cook," he said, smiling as he stirred the sauce. "I'm not just brooding on motorcycles all day." "I don't know," she smirked. "That's kind of your brand." "Tonight," he said, turning down the flame, "my brand is risotto and roasted vegetables." She laughed, walking closer, brushing her hand gently across his back as she passed him to peek into the pan. The touch was innocent, but even that small contact made something inside them both stir, like a memory resurfacing from a dream they once shared but never acknowledged. They ate at a small table in the corner of his living room, by a wide window where the moonlight spilled like silk over the hardwood floor. There were candles, not staged or decorative but used, melted into the holders like they belonged to evenings of reading and stillness. There was music, too. Soft jazz in the background, the kind that made silences feel full rather than empty. They talked about everything and nothing. Childhood memories, the way Hollywood had changed. Her kids, his motorcycles, her fear of being too late, his guilt for never saying more when he should have. And for a long time, there were no walls between them. No rehearsed answers. No polished personas. Just two people unwrapping years of quiet questions with trembling hands and brave smiles. "I remember watching you walk away from that press event in Toronto," Sandra said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "And I knew, deep in my gut, I should have run after you." He didn't interrupt. He let her speak, let her voice find its way through the moment. But I didn't. I was scared that if I said too much, I'd break everything we had. And if I'm honest, maybe part of me believed I didn't deserve something that pure. Keanu looked at her then, his eyes holding that familiar stillness that had comforted so many but had hidden so much. "You've always deserved more than the world gave you credit for, Sandra. You weren't just someone I cared about. You were the one I never stopped seeing, even when I was looking at someone else." Tears prickled her eyes, not from sadness, but from the beauty of hearing words she never thought she'd receive. She reached for his hand across the table, their fingers interlocking not with fire but with a quiet, powerful understanding. It wasn't lust, it wasn't nostalgia, it was recognition. "I think we've always been afraid," she whispered. "Afraid that if we stepped into this, we wouldn't know how to stay." Keanu squeezed her hand gently. "Maybe we were just waiting until we knew how to fight for it." They didn't rush the evening. There was no whirlwind, no cinematic music swelling. Instead, there was comfort, the kind that comes when two souls who've walked through storms finally find shelter not in solitude, but in each other. After dinner, they settled on the couch, a blanket shared across their laps, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her with a protectiveness that had always existed, quietly, in the background of their friendship. They watched an old movie, the kind with black and white dialogue and heartbeats disguised as glances. Neither one fully watched the screen. They watched each other. As the credits rolled, Keanu turned to her, brushing his thumb gently along her jaw. "You're the only person I've ever been scared to lose before I even had." Her lips parted, her heart catching in her chest. "Then don't wait any longer." He leaned in, not as a leading man, not as a fantasy, but as Keanu. Just Keanu. And she kissed him, not as Sandra Bullock the actress or the public's sweetheart, but as the woman who had waited too long to allow herself to be loved this way. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't fireworks. It was gentle, deep, and filled with everything they had never said. It was years of missed chances finding their voice all at once. When they finally pulled apart, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their foreheads rested against each other, breaths shared, hearts finally in rhythm. Later that night, as Sandra stood at his front door, keys in hand, she looked back at him. What we're doing. It's not just a moment, is it?" Keanu shook his head slowly, stepping forward, his voice a whisper of truth. It's the beginning of everything we were too scared to believe we deserved. And as the door closed softly behind her, she knew, this time, she wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide behind the script of caution. Because love, when it's true, doesn't demand a perfect story. It only asks to be chosen, and they were finally ready to choose it. When the world found out, and they didn't flinch. It started as a whisper, a blurry photo taken from across the street, just a silhouette of two people under the same umbrella, one unmistakably tall and quiet, the other poised and radiant even through the rain. It was posted on a small fan account, captioned only with a hopeful question. Is that Sandra and Keanu? Together. By the end of the week, the whisper had grown into a wave. Headlines danced across entertainment blogs with the hungry rhythm of curiosity. Reeves and Bullock spotted arm in arm, romance confirmed. But while the world buzzed, they, at the center of it all, moved with the calm of people who had nothing left to prove. Not to the media, not to their careers, not to the clock that had ticked quietly beside them for 30 years. Inside Sandra's home, things remained grounded. Her life, normally structured and rehearsed, was now beautifully messy in the most personal of ways. Coffee mugs left on the piano bench because they'd sat talking there for hours. Keanu's worn leather jacket hanging on the back of a kitchen chair. A shared playlist echoing from speakers, songs that never made it into soundtracks but made it into their hearts. Her children noticed, too. Not in the dramatic, life-altering way the tabloids might imagine, but in the smaller, more tender things. How their mother smiled when texting, how she hummed while making dinner, how she laughed, really laughed, when Keanu was around. He didn't try to be their father, didn't overstep. He simply listened, supported, showed up. And somehow, in his silent gentleness, he said more than most men ever could with words. They hadn't planned to go public. They hadn't even talked about it in concrete terms. But love, real love, refuses to stay hidden. And when they attended a low-key film charity event together, side by side, fingers interlaced as they greeted old friends and colleagues, the cameras clicked like 1,000 butterflies taking flight at once. The moment wasn't posed. It wasn't a performance. It was simple, honest, a lifetime in the making. And it shook people, not in scandal, but in awe. Because rarely does Hollywood offer a love story that isn't polished for screens, scripted by agents, or shattered by ego. This was something else. This was raw, patient, and heartbreakingly human. Of course, the world reacted as it always does. Some cheered, others speculated. There were headlines laced with cheap nostalgia and even cheaper cynicism. Too little too late? Why now? Are Sandra and Keanu just giving fans what they want? But none of it mattered. Not to them. Because the only people who had waited for this moment longer than the fans were the two souls who had finally stopped waiting. On a quiet morning, 3 weeks after the first photo leaked, they sat on Sandra's back porch wrapped in a shared blanket, legs tangled beneath the chill of early spring. Her dog lay curled at their feet. The sky was streaked with soft blues and gold, the kind of sunrise that felt like a second chance. They sipped tea and read pages from the same book, passing it back and forth like a conversation. And when she asked gently, "Do you regret anything?" he didn't answer right away. Instead, Keanu set down the mug, reached for her hand, and let the silence speak first. Then, with a soft exhale, he said, "Only that I let fear write so many chapters for us. But I don't regret where it led us. I don't regret who we became to find our way back here." Sandra leaned her head on his shoulder, eyes closed, tears gathering in the corners of her lashes. Not from pain, but from relief. I used to wonder if some loves just weren't meant to be lived out loud. If maybe ours was only meant to exist in moments between the moments. But we're here now, Keanu finished, wrapping his arm around her. We're the moment now. Their days began to stretch in new directions. Not rushed, not consumed by filming schedules or rehearsals. They carved out time, long walks in hidden parks, spontaneous road trips up the coast, homemade dinners filled with laughter and slow dancing in the kitchen to vinyl records that crackled like warm firewood. They weren't pretending to be young. They weren't trying to rewrite lost years. They were simply meeting themselves as they were, older, wiser, softer in the places that had once been guarded. Then came the interview. It was Oprah, of course. Who else could hold a space big enough for a story like theirs? It wasn't planned as a revelation. It wasn't even advertised as the big couple reveal. But once the cameras rolled and Oprah asked gently, "So, what changed between you two?" There was a pause, followed by the kind of smile that spoke louder than any headline ever could. "We stopped being afraid of what we could lose," Sandra answered, her hand finding Keanu's instinctively. "And we started thinking about what we might gain." That line became a quote, a meme, a shared post with millions of likes. But for Sandra and Keanu, it wasn't about virality. It was about truth. And for two people who had spent decades being characters in other people's fantasies, this truth was more freeing than any role they'd ever played. In private, though, is where the real love bloomed. Quiet breakfasts with her kids before school. Keanu helping fix the garage door and pretending he knew more about springs and hinges than he did. Sandra reading him the first pages of a script she hadn't told anyone else about yet. Nights curled up watching old movies not because they needed the story, but because they already were one. They didn't rush to move in. They didn't announce wedding plans. There were no engagement rings posted on Instagram. They simply showed up, every day, again and again, until the rhythm of their hearts felt like home. And perhaps the most beautiful part of it all was this: they never tried to be perfect. They allowed each other the space to be messy, to be tired, to be complicated. They didn't fall in love with an ideal. They walked into love with open eyes and steady steps, because this wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. Time didn't slow down for them. No, that was the illusion people like to believe about love later in life. Time, in truth, kept moving. Days blended into months, and the world continued to spin with its noise, its flashes, its headlines. But for Sandra and Keanu, time began to feel different. Not because it paused, but because they finally stopped resisting it. They didn't try to hold on to every moment like it might slip through their fingers. They simply lived them. Fully. Openly. Quietly. They had both played characters who fought fate, who chased explosions and jumped from speeding trains. But in real life, the grandest act of courage had been choosing each other without spectacle. They kept things grounded, even as the world around them tried to mythologize what they now had. Keanu still visited his quiet bookshop near Fairfax on Sundays, still bought secondhand poetry collections and spoke to the owner like an old friend. Sandra still did school drop-offs wearing oversized sunglasses and hoodies, blending into the morning chaos of other mothers with Starbucks cups and half-done hair. Their love didn't demand attention. It created peace. And in a world where most people were screaming to be seen, that peace stood out like a song no one had heard but somehow everyone remembered. There came a night in early summer, when the sky turned lavender too early and the ocean breeze carried something sweet and heavy. They had taken a trip up the coast, no paparazzi, no assistance, just a car with a cracked windshield and playlists they made together on the drive. They stayed in a small house overlooking the cliffs, the kind of place where the horizon stretched endlessly and the silence had weight. That night they sat on the porch after dinner, a single candle flickering between them, and Sandra looked at Keanu with eyes that had seen him through decades of change, loss, growth, and still, love. "I want to ask you something," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the waves crashing below. Keanu leaned in, his hand already covering hers. "Anything. If we'd had this years ago, do you think it would have worked?" He didn't answer quickly. He didn't smile it away or offer poetic comfort. He looked out toward the ocean, let the question breathe, and then turned to her with something solemn and certain in his eyes. "I think we would have ruined it," he said. "Not because we didn't care, but because we didn't know how to stay. We were running on separate roads, good people, wrong timing. Back then, I was still learning how to exist with the pain. You were still learning how to stop carrying everyone else's expectations." Sandra nodded slowly, a tear rolling down her cheek, not from sadness but from the quiet ache of clarity. "So, this is it. This is our real beginning." Keanu smiled gently, brushing the tear away with his thumb. "No, this is our middle. We've already begun." That night, under a sky painted with stars and the music of old tides, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out something small and simple, and set it in her palm. It wasn't a ring. It wasn't diamonds or declarations. It was a folded note, the edges softened from time. Her name was written on the outside, and when she opened it, her breath caught. It was a letter, dated 10 years ago. He had written it after seeing her on a red carpet, laughing with someone else looking radiant. He hadn't sent it. He hadn't even told her it existed. Inside, he wrote about everything he'd never said out loud. How watching her from a distance was both beautiful and torturous. How every time he saw her, he heard the version of himself he was too afraid to be. How he had loved her quietly, like a secret language only his soul understood. Sandra folded the letter, pressing it to her chest. "You kept this all this time? I thought maybe one day you'd need to know, even if I never got the chance to say it." She reached for him then, no hesitation, her heart pouring through every touch, every tear, every breath. "Keanu, you don't have to be quiet anymore. You're allowed to love me loudly now." They kissed under the open sky, not a kiss of youth or longing, but one of certainty, of forgiveness, of finding something you thought the world had hidden too well to ever reach again. It was a kiss that didn't ask for attention. It asked for truth, and it gave everything back in return. When they returned to Los Angeles, they didn't hide. They walked into the restaurant hand in hand, heads high, not as a surprise couple or a PR stunt, but as two people who had earned the right to love openly. When photographers shouted their names, they smiled, not for the cameras, but for each other. When fans whispered and pointed, they didn't flinch. They had already lived through loneliness, grief, rejection, and silence. What was left to fear? A few weeks later, at a private gala for children's health research, an event close to Sandra's heart, they arrived together, dressed in quiet elegance. She wore deep navy silk, minimal jewelry. He wore a black suit with a gray shirt, no tie. They weren't trying to impress. They simply looked like they belonged. And halfway through the night, as she stood on stage delivering a heartfelt speech, Sandra paused. Her eyes found Keanu in the crowd, his posture relaxed, his gaze soft, proud, unshaken, and then, in front of hundreds, she said something that made the entire room go still. "There's someone in this room who taught me that love doesn't need permission. It doesn't follow timing. It waits, patiently, quietly. It doesn't rush or demand. It becomes, and when it finally arrives, it feels less like falling and more like coming home." People clapped. Some even stood, but Keanu didn't move. He simply smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling in that way only she could recognize. Later that night, someone posted a photo of them from behind, his hand on the small of her back, her head leaned against his shoulder. The caption read simply, "Some things are worth waiting for." It went viral, not because it was shocking, but because it was real, and real, in a world of make-believe, still had the power to stop everything. The end.